you take your seats, because we're going to continue precisely now. Ladies. So, welcome everybody. This session is a conversation. You've actually instigated under Thomas a very good conversation in the previous regime, and we want to continue with that spirit. There's a very famous intellectual, actually also from Oxford, where I come from, called Theodore Zeldin, who wrote perhaps the best book ever on the French. And we will shortly hear from the French ambassador, so it's quite appropriate that I mention him. And he has written a fantastic book called The Art of Conversation. And he thinks that conversation is the single most powerful feature in the development and civilization of mankind. So we're going to have that conversation, and it's going to help us civilize and develop ourselves. Part of that process, which he so values, is the ability to listen, okay? So we can listen to each other, and I know look, you've done a lot of listening, and we'll try, but we've got a big platform here, we'll try to involve you and engage you as much as possible. The other ingredient, he says, which is often forgotten, this is a message to Thomas, you can't really see him because the lights are here, is silence. That's also a very important ingredient in conversation. Now, we've got a nice, interesting platform here, and I propose to operate in this way so that we stay on time, because we're also looking forward to our drink this evening. What we're going to do is to go back to the initial presentation that Pithart gave us to open us, a wonderful address, and discuss a few of those ideas, but also expand and develop on them. And there are two things that I remember very strongly from his presentation this morning. One was his definition of powerlessness, which is what our invoking theme for the conference from that famous essay by Václav Havel. And he said, we are powerless, but not in the same way that people were powerless under the communists. So we're in a democracy, and we're committed to democracy, and we all believe in that, but somehow we're powerless. And of course that idea has been discussed in the two previous sessions. So we may want to, and I'm inviting our speakers to think a little bit about where is the power. I like this idea that Ivan said of the voter as a detective, looking for power, and when he or she finds it, that's when he or she becomes engaged. So if it's not in Brussels or if it's not in Prague, they obviously are a little bit dissatisfied. The second idea that he said was, when he talked about European values, he made this sentence: what do we have to give up for European values? Now, I'm not sure if we all agree that we have to give up something. I come from India, and we have multiple identities at the same time, and we're very happy to exercise that. So another little idea that I took from his talk is, should we be giving up something to become that wonderful new European citizen, or should we just add something, or what can we gain? Now what we're going to do is, we've got three panelists to get us going, and they've been carefully selected to represent different parts of us, of European people. And I'll introduce the speakers as they speak. The first speaker, who represents, some people might say old Europe, I don't like that phrase. Some people might say West Europe, well it's a little bit clumsy. But anyway, the Europe that helped found the European Union. And we have the French ambassador, His Excellency Jean-Pierre Asvazadourian, who has worked in London, in Copenhagen, in Argentina, but also has spent a long time in Prague. So he's a great friend of us. I think so. Have you got a...
Good evening. First of all, I wish to thank all those who contributed to this very important event organized by the Václav Havel Library. I'm very glad to take part to it in company of the other members of this panel. I'm pleased indeed to participate in today's discussion on Europe and democracy, a topic which is a key issue, especially in the prospect of the upcoming European elections in May. Furthermore, debating today on citizen, democracy and Europe seems also very timely in the face of the dramatic events which are taking place in Ukraine. There were many references today to Ukraine during this conference, and I'd like to have a special thoughts for those who strive so that respect of human rights and democracy could prevail. I also understand that I'm here to represent the vision of the post-war West European project. I should feel like one of the founding fathers, or rather after 6 decades of European integration, of grandfather of the European family. But I'm not alone, because Anne also represents Netherlands. It's also a founding father. But I shall try not to sound too nostalgic, and what should matter is rather where we are heading and how to achieve it. And I'm not sure that there will be fundamental differences between the French vision and the one of the Czech Republic or the one of young Europeans. I do believe we have much more in common than what makes us different. And what brings us together is, above all, a set of values, the first of which is our attachment to democracy, citizen rights, and also solidarity. And I think that even if we often take values for granted, they are meaningful for many people, not only for the elites. And like some of the necessarily complex European mechanisms, they are understandable to all. From my point of view, the European project, the one we are carrying on today, was at its beginning probably based less on democracy as such than how to achieve peace and prosperity through economic cooperation. The initial idea was simple, but altogether profoundly innovative. If we, French and German, share the control of our coal and our steel, which were the prime materials of the defense industry, if we interconnect our economies, we'll make it impossible to start any conflict, and we'll build trust on shared interest. But I do not believe you can separate economy and democracy, of course. In all the steps that followed in the creation of a more united Europe, we saw economic and political integration moving forward together, accompanied by the willingness to improve democracy. And maybe it is interesting to stress that when we talk about democracy in the EU context, we obviously mean democratic values and citizens' rights, but also the balance between countries that are very different in terms of size, of population, or economic weight. It is important to recall at a moment when it is the aim of critics and doubts that the European integration process has always been and still remains a magnet. It is because of its deepening economic cooperation and its democratic values that the European community attracted more members, in particular those who suffered from democratic deficit at some point during the post-war period. I think, for example, of the Spain, Portugal and Greece joining in the 80s, and of course of the former communist countries of Central and Eastern Europe that entered the EU 10 years ago. I also think of the countries that aspire to join the EU nowadays. I would like to recall that when awarding the Nobel Peace Prize to the EU in October 2012, the Nobel Committee underlined its contribution to the advancement of peace and reconciliation, democracy and human rights in Europe as its greatest achievement, even at a time when the EU was facing serious economic difficulties and considerable social problems. Indeed, the union that we have built is probably the most advanced group of countries regarding democracy, rights and freedoms. Let's mention, for example, the freedom of movement, which we often take for granted, or the Charter of Fundamental Rights that enshrine political but also social and economic rights for European citizens and residents into EU law. Beyond its borders as well, the EEC and then the EU have contributed for many years to promote democratic values in different ways. In international institutions, certainly, but also, for example, in the framework of its development assistance programs or association agreements, which include now a political dimension and support for democracy and the rule of law. So the EU was a great catalyst for democracy inside and outside of Europe, and still is. But how democratic is the EU itself? It has become very commonplace to speak about the democratic deficit in the EU, its governance with lack of democratic legitimacy. It is often people's perception, and this question are certainly to be addressed. The progressive transfer of some legislative powers from our national parliaments to the Commission or the Council has sparked over the years fears of loss of sovereignty and democracy. The introduction of direct election of the European Parliament was a step to answer the question of democratic deficit. In this context, we all agree to recognize that this year's elections are a defining moment in EU life due to the growing powers of the European Parliament in the decision-making process. For the first time this year, under the Treaty of Lisbon, the European Parliament will elect the next President of the European Commission on the basis of a proposal by the European Council, taking into account the political balance from the election. But from the previous election, it appears a paradox that the increase in the European Parliament's powers does not reduce the level of abstention. And particularly this year, the complex economic and social situation in the EU might trigger an even higher abstention or might encourage a rising number of voters turning towards populist movements that use the EU as a scapegoat. So what can be done to overcome this mistrust or this lack of interest in the EU from its own citizens? I'd like briefly to make 2 points. First, beyond the question of the next elections, the only way to bring the citizen closer to the EU is for the EU itself to focus on issues that matter to people. And this is not about institutions, treaties, or sometimes bureaucratic or technocratic regulations. It is about content, about promoting a model which sustains the economy, creates jobs, and guarantees the sustainability of our social and welfare systems. When 14 million young Europeans are unemployed in this continent, it is our duty to put that issue on top of the European agenda. Otherwise, there is the risk of a whole generation turning its back to Europe. Convincing the citizens of the benefit they can draw from the EU, demonstrating that Europe is not the problem but one of the solutions, is the sole way to make them feel part of this ambitious project. Secondly, the citizens too often are unaware of Europe's achievements and impact in their life. This is the responsibility of governments, political parties, and also the media to do their share of pedagogy. We must not demonstrate naive optimism, but we should not worsen the picture either. And beyond the implementation of the necessary concept of subsidiarity, there are many examples able to make Europe closer to its citizens. For example, urban policy, great infrastructures, assistance programs to the poorest achieved through EU funding. The focus by the EU on regional cooperation, because it is close to people and tackles topics that affect the citizens directly. The concept of European citizenship is not a hollow concept. It means if you are Czech national in France, you can vote for the mayor of your hometown and for your French European deputy. If you are Czech national outside of the EU, in an area where your country is not represented, you can get assistance from the French, German, Spanish embassy or consulate. We must also remind the citizens that culture, education, science and research are a priority. You might remember that Jean Monnet is supposed to have said, if I had to start over, I would start with culture. Many projects are successfully implemented in that field to protect the diversity of our cultures and languages. Valkering, for example, will be European Capital of Culture next year. In the field of education, the Erasmus program is an exceptional achievement of the EU. 2 generations have already benefited from it. I could also mention the field of research and innovation. The headquarters of the Galileo European Agency are located a few blocks from here. None of our countries would have been able to build a global satellite navigation system on its own. Let's not forget either the common agricultural policy, which must allow us to have greener and fairer agriculture, which has consumer protection as a priority, or that the EU action on energy and climate has the urban citizens as primary beneficiaries as well. I could go on. Those are few examples of concrete European policies that are part of our daily lives, even if we don't always realize it. I could also add that the EU is not a straitjacket. It also allows the possibility for the country which want to have in a specific field a closer cooperation, or go forward at a faster pace. I think, for example, of the Schengen cooperation, or the euro. To conclude, I think that in order to cope with a perceived democratic deficit and restore the European confidence in their common project, the EU must focus on concrete solutions to the crisis, putting the emphasis on democracy, growth and solidarity. Sometimes also, the EU suffers from a lack of information, explanation and appropriate, interactive and comprehensible communication. This is our responsibility to make sure this will change, and I'm convinced that this conference will contribute to this goal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and thank you for reminding us of some of the successes coming out of the EU and some of the challenges that, in a way, can only be solved collectively. We shouldn't forget that. On the other hand, and this will be the challenge to our second speaker, who's Anne Valkering, who runs an international debate association based out of the Netherlands, which aims to get young people involved in debate and discussion about issues that matter. But the question to her will be whether that's sufficient, whether there is enough going down to actually change the widespread perception about what's called a democratic deficit. Is kind of an unwieldy phrase. So Anne, over to you.
Thank you very much. Is this microphone? Yeah, it's on. Perfect. Great. I will be speaking for young people in Europe. I'm not quite sure if I still qualify as a young person, but I try to represent whatever the experience of young people is in Europe. Even though I was 9 when I saw the pictures of the wall falling and all the fantastic achievements that happened and the optimism that existed in the early 1990s. And therefore maybe have a different picture of what the European Union could be and was and now is than people who are younger than me, who were born and basically have used, for example, the euro their whole life, have never experienced showing a passport anywhere when they're crossing a border, and all of the other benefits that I sort of got used to and they have taken for granted during their whole life. But still, I think there's a number of things that I can represent young people for. And you'll notice when I say we versus they, which is when I describe young people as a foreign entity that I don't really understand anymore. I will talk firstly about the kind of disinterest that we see among young people, and then I'll talk about why, what could be the reasons why European youth maybe aren't as interested in the EU as they should be. And then I'll look at what kind of alternative movements exist within or between young people, and how can we make use of that as European Union, or have some kind of ideas for that. That would be too practical to get into maybe. Alright, so first of all, when we look at disinterest among youth, we've already mentioned, or someone has mentioned, that 60% of young people are not likely to go vote for the European Parliament elections. They express a disinterest and a distrust for the European Union. So there clearly is a problem. It might not be a democratic deficit, as was expressed, but there clearly is something that we need to fix, because young people don't see their future within the EU as it exists right now. And also, it has become totally acceptable to not know anything about the European Union, or not care, or to express that you're disinterested in the European Union as a sort of standard thing. I work a lot with students who debate. They're some of the most interested human beings that I know of. They're willing to spend a week during their Christmas break or during their summer holiday speaking about military intervention in Syria, speaking about euthanasia rights, or speaking about all sorts of other things that are in-depth moral, ethical issues, but they're very frequently unwilling to talk about the EU. They just think it's not interesting. The only other thing they loathe more is speaking about football, which they just find completely uninteresting. Now, if you work with these kind of people and they express that kind of sentiment towards the EU, you can sort of imagine what normal people would feel like and what's happening there. And the funny thing is that young people aren't necessarily uninterested in politics, and they aren't necessarily uninterested in ethical issues. And we don't just see that when they put their Facebook status, they change it into a rainbow flag right before Sochi, or when they express an interest in discussions about Ukraine or Venezuela or other places that are experiencing problems. But they are generally interested. We just don't know how to capture that. And what could potentially be reasons for that? I think the first problem is that basically we did grow up in the European Union. We know the benefits, but we don't really know what it was like when we didn't have the benefits. We've mostly grown up in peace. We've mostly grown up in welfare, and now we suddenly see it go down. Or at least we see people paint a picture where it will go down. I'm still the optimistic part that thinks, no, everything will get better at some point anyway. But definitely a lot of people feel that the EU doesn't necessarily bring the benefits that it had been pictured to bring. Doesn't necessarily get us out of unemployment, and is generally ineffectual in that sense. But more importantly, probably, there's also the idea that there is a general distrust, not just towards the EU, but towards most institutions, towards all sorts of politics, towards nation states, towards local elections even, and towards any sort of authority figure. Because no one's really listening to us. And by us, I mean to a certain extent normal people in general, but more especially youth in many countries. Because we are probably the ones carrying the burden of mistakes made in the 1950s when pension systems were built in a way that now prove not to be sustainable. We are probably the ones that need to go into a competition with countries with much lower wages, and therefore pay the price of an economic system that wasn't necessarily always well controlled. And that is something that people do feel, that there is a distinction between older and younger people, not on a personal level, because many older people will express the same idea that we need to fix things for the future generations, but definitely on a systematic level, young people are carrying a burden and won't necessarily see the benefits coming. Now, then the extra problem, and the real reason why people dislike the authority, I think, is that it's sort of a nebulous, interconnected crowd of things that there's not really a person who's in charge or an institution that's in charge. There's all sorts of different institutions that always point the finger to each other. We've already mentioned, or someone mentioned, the EU blames the economy points to wrong decisions on a political level, and countries blame the EU blames countries. So there's no one to actually point a finger to and blame, but more importantly, to call when you need a solution. Like we now have a foreign minister, sort of, so we know who to call when we want to talk to the EU, but we don't know who to call to actually fix unemployment among youth, or fix the economic crisis. And that doesn't necessarily have to be one person, but we do need like clear lines of who do we need to talk to and what do we need to do. Now, what do we see among young people? How many minutes have I left? All right. My timer ran out. What we do see, on the one hand, we see people opting out, people becoming apathetic, particularly when they also lost their jobs, when they live in countries where most people have become apathetic. That's something we definitely don't want. We also see more extremism on the right and the left. And there's not much of a distinction anymore in some cases between the right and the left. At least in the Netherlands, we're all against immigrants, and that's the main thing on the extremism on either side. And that's generally scary. But more importantly, what we also see is that many young people are reshaping their life. They're not like in the 1970s making the personal political, but they're making politics personal. So they're making personal decisions in their life, in how they consume, what they do, like how they exchange between people that are political. So they become part of the Occupy movement, but they also become, they trade in Bitcoin. They also sort of become people who have local exchanges and only work in a local economy and exchange favors instead of actually using a money economy. They try to work more sustainably and more environmentally friendly. But they do so locally, and they connect through the internet with other people who do so, and they ask each other advice. They talk about what could be good solutions. But that is very grassroots, and there's no real connection to what happens on the politics level. And we can't really find a way to connect these two yet. And that is where, I need half a minute more. And that is where the EU might come in. Because the EU, what it shouldn't be doing is advertising its achievements and sort of top-down telling us, this is what we've done and this is fantastic. But what it should try to do a lot more, and it has done it a tiny bit through internet fora where you can discuss the treaty, this one of those treaties. But it should try to capture that energy of all these young people trying to reshape their lives and trying to reshape that economy more actively through social fora, through ways in which there is more participatory democracy. And if we can find ways to do that, I think we do capture the interest of youth, and it will be a lot better than it used to be.
Thank you very much, Anne, for representing the youth here. I'm going to ask our next speaker, who represents, if you like, the old Central, or what we might call now the East Europe, but it's the new Europe. It's the Europe that's really contributing. So it's Libor rouček, who has been in the European Parliament for 10 years and has also been in the Czech Parliament. So the challenge for you, which has been thrown out by Anne very directly, is how do we connect, from your perspective, sitting in Brussels, but also as a representative of ordinary citizens and peoples, how do we connect? Or is there something deeper going on? Because listening to Anne, one almost felt that, is this a crisis beyond Europe? Is this a crisis of young people in the world, social media? Is there a new kind of civic spirit emerging, which we are the most aware of because we're quite self-referential in Europe, but it may not be just our problem. So can I just remind people, listening is part of the conversation, so don't talk too much.
Yes. Okay, I won't talk too much. I will start with the situation 25 years ago, because where did we connect the so-called old Europe and the new Europe? What was common? I think there was a common experience. Common experience made in Western Europe during the war and of course after the war. So that's why from the beginning the European integration is based on human rights, civil rights, rule of law, democracy. Because whether the French or German or Dutch or the Europeans learned the lessons of Second World War. Now we have 100th anniversary of the First World War. We had 2 terrible wars in Europe. And now we have almost 70 years of peace. And nobody can imagine that we will have another war. And I think that's what makes difference, where we differ from other parts of the world. Because look to East Asia. The countries are well developed. Japan, South Korea, huge progress in the last 30, 40, 50 years. China is moving forwards. But is the peace guaranteed there? I think it isn't. A small spark, conflict over some piece of rock in North China or South China Sea can spark the war. Why? Because they didn't create this concept of integration based on human rights, democracy, rule of law. So when the Iron Curtain fell, when the Berlin Wall fell, when the Velvet Revolution arrived in Prague, you know, the Czechs, Slovaks, East Germans, Hungarian Poles, we could go somewhere. And it was the situation, you know, unlike between the wars, where we didn't have this concept. So we joined the European integration. One of the slogans of the Velvet Revolution was "Back to Europe" or "Return to Europe," because we wanted to live in this community of democracy, but we also wanted to live in the community of prosperity, because the Western Europe was symbol of prosperity. Now we are 25 years later, and for many people, including young people, these freedoms are quite normal. The young people who were born, you know, in 1985 don't remember the Iron Curtain, that you couldn't go to Germany or Austria. You know, now it's free. They don't need passports. They can study in Netherlands or France or wherever. It's automatic. And the young people are step by step, because becoming part of the Europe. When I mention the standard of living, here we have a problem, because not only the Bulgarians or the Romanians, but even the East Germans, almost 25 years since the reunification, are still lagging behind. With the financial and economic crisis, of course, in many countries we have high unemployment. When we talk about migration, in Netherlands, the people are scared, or in Britain or France, they are scared of migrants coming into the country. If you talk to Lithuanians, Latvians, you know, Poles, Romanians, Bulgarians, they have the opposite problem, because they lost, you know, 10, 15, sometimes even 20% of the population. So the people still don't feel, you know, fully part of Europe. They don't feel that they grew together. And of course, this will take time. There is also unfinished business still as far as the enlargement is concerned. And the new Europeans, the Poles, the Czechs, the Hungarians, you know, we should remind this to our friends and colleagues in the West, that they are still, you know, Serbs and Albanians and Montenegrins who are not yet part of the European integration of the EU. You spoke before about Ukraine, and we can see that the Ukrainians, you know, on Maidan or on Lviv, when they wave the European flag, so they mean something similar. They have some similar type of dream we had 25 years ago, because they want to live in freedom, they want to live in democracy, they want to have, you know, good standard of living, to have friends in Western Europe. So again, I think we, you know, shouldn't forget this, and we should offer solidarity, because these are, as we mentioned, the European values: human rights, civil rights, rule of law, solidarity. Maybe still one last point, because it was mentioned also in the previous debates. The European social models. Yes, it is true that there are many models. The different one in Scandinavia, different one in France, and different one in Germany. But what is common, you know, in contrast, let's say, even to the United States, you know, our friends across the Atlantic, that young people, you know, have the chance to study, for instance. That when you get old, you have, you know, guaranteed pension. This type of you know, social rights, people that are used to, people can only dream of in other parts of the world, East Asia, and not mentioning Africa. So again, here I think Europe is different. When we talk about globalization, when we talk about competition, China was mentioned. I don't think that, you know, neither West Europeans nor East Europeans want to have Chinese wages or Chinese you know, social standards, environmental standards, and so on. So here I will stop, and I will give the floor fellow speakers. Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much, Libor. So, in a way, a bit more of Europe and a bit more of democracy, and we can keep going. Now, I would like to bring back into the conversation our very own Petr Pithart, who spoke to us earlier, and everybody knows him. He's one of the torchbearers for Havelian thinking. So I'd like to see what, if you'd like to make some comments on the initial panelists, so I think I've got us to a good start, and then I will bring in the colleagues on my left here, and I'll introduce them in a moment. So Peter.
If I was listening well, the red line in the debate was how to do with the lack of interest among youngsters, and the intervention of Mrs. Vicenova was extremely interesting, and not only for me, and encouraging in a way, because she explained that these ministers of foreign affairs and prime ministers, they in the end take the right decision, and that they are able to find agreement, and the decision is unanimous. And at the same time, she added with a skeptical smile, there is no time to explain it, and nobody is even trying to explain it. So how can we expect interest from intelligent young people when nobody would explain how the decision was taken and why it was taken? We make out of them powerless people, of course, differently than it happened that existed before 1989. But the result is the same, and it represents a possible tragic ending, because they take the right decisions, but they have no time to make the decisions legitimate. In the end, they manage to bring together all opponents of the Union. And in some other elections, Europe can be refused and the different states will be exiting, because the skeptics will be getting the upper hand with its nationalistic tainting. And I also liked the fact that the skeptics play a useful and positive role, and she added in an adequate number, and we all laughed. In the Czech Republic, we have lived, and it is still felt, the worst kind of skepticism, and it has a distinct nationalistic tainting, because, it was said from the top positions, Brussels, these are indeed Germans, and what they couldn't do during the war, they will do it now. And this is totally destructive, and a skepticism that can threaten the European Union. What should we do? You will have no situation where everybody will be active, all citizens, and daddy and mommy won't be sitting in the kitchen reading the European Constitution in the evening in the kitchen, So that's why I mentioned the example of the initiative of 20 NGOs, the reconstruction of the state. We should interconnect those who are already active, and the interconnection should be organized. It is taking place somewhere, but it doesn't take place of its own. We should already involve those who are active. And let's wish that the first debate that should be traveling around Europe, let's have it as an inspiration, because the potential of responsible young people is there, but they didn't have the opportunity to fulfill their interest and responsibility. Tomáš Sedláček must be absent, but at one point he asked, aren't we too philosophical today? And he meant, aren't we too skeptical, perhaps? We probably are, at least some of us, and we are not too pleased by it, but we are afraid of the outcome of the next election. Maybe his view is different, because even if the decision of the EU bodies were the best and the most responsible, if they don't work at once at the legitimacy of all decisions and at the way how these are explained, in spite of all the goodwill, the result may not be good, because maybe we are too philosophical. And the story, the narrative is really what people are telling each other, what they are sharing. It is not what is the result of a meeting of the wisest Europeans. But maybe together with the crisis in the Ukraine, there is a possibility for a narrative. If the European Union would manage, and it could be at the expense of the sacrifice, bigger than small, there could be an embryo of a narrative, but this would mean that in foreign policy we should start to behave differently than we did in the past. Maybe it will feel constrained to it. You know, whether it finds its way itself or is constrained to it, there is a large drama at our borders connected with the existence of the European Union, and we've never seen anything like that in the past. So something evil could be even positive in this respect.
Thank you very much, Petr, for those words. And history has shown that crisis, although it is obviously a moment of great concern, can also be a moment of great opportunity. So I heed those words. Now we're going to turn to three distinguished journalists who are, in a sense, journalists are representatives of us, of the people. If they're doing their best work, they're challenging power, they're speaking truth to power. We have some various degrees of power, and will probably say I don't represent power. But the other two colleagues are certainly in power, and one has great influence. So I'm going to invite them to, in a sense, contribute, maybe with a comment or maybe with a question. And then I'm going to throw it open to the floor. So we're going to take a number of contributions, and then I'm going to give these panelists a short word at the end, and then we move to what some of you will consider the more important business of a drink. So let me start with Igor Záruba, who is the editor-in-chief of the E15 Weekly, which I presume is to do with Europe? Yes. And of course. And please, we'd love to hear from you.
Is it on? Starting our small blog, I would like to start with a question. The question goes to Anne. And please, in your speech, you pointed out the terms distrust, disinterest regarding the forthcoming EU election, and mostly by the young people. Do you have any recipe in a recommendation how to combat that?
Okay.
Thank you.
So our next contributor from the media is Kateřina Šafaříková, who is an editor on Respect, which I've had translated to me occasionally. I know it's your premier magazine. She's also worked at Lidové noviny and has worked a lot on Brussels. So please, Kateřina.
Thank you. I would have a question that would relate to what Mr. Asvazadourian said, but it might be kind of like a general question, general comment, which is when Mr. Ambassador was talking about what values unite us, he mentioned solidarity, human rights, democracy. Then also he mentioned freedom of movement as an example of how highly developed we are. If we look at things like solidarity, freedom of movement, particularly these two values, achievements are in immense stress and be questioned in almost every member state. The last example was actually non-EU member state, but still European state, Switzerland, that has in referendum voted for restriction of freedom of movement, of immigration. And my question is, if a freedom of movement is being questioned, if solidarity is being questioned, and is being questioned by especially the Czech Republic and the new member states, what is the idea of Europe? What does unite us now, 2014? Thank you.
Before I bring in our final media interlocutor, I'm going to actually pose a question to you, Adam, but also if you want to come back to you. There was, the ambassador made the challenge, I think I wrote it down, the media must also do their part for the pedagogy. In other words, the media have a role in the making of our, I hope it's our Europe, of our European space. And referring back to Klaus Offer's wonderful talk earlier, he talked quite a lot about the public sphere, which we lack. We lack a public sphere, and that prevents the sort of flourishing cross-border intellectual debates that we'd like to have. So Adam Černý, who is our final contributor, is the foreign editor at Hospodářské noviny, if I get it right. So if you would, I don't know if you want to also, apart from your comment and question, if you'd like to make some reaction to what I've just said about the particular role of the media, and whether you feel it has done its bit in this European story, or why you feel constrained if it doesn't, or whatever. If you'd like to say anything, but please.
Thank you. Generally speaking, I think that the role of the media is exaggerated. The governments are setting the agenda. The only thing we can do is explain to ask. Pardon? The role of the media, generally speaking, is exaggerated. The only
Can you hear?
Do you see?
Can you just put it closer?
Yeah.
That's it.
You
see, journalists don't actually like, they're very good behind the scenes. We want you to be in front now.
I think the role of the media is, generally speaking, exaggerated. First part. The only thing that we can do is to translate it, to ask responsible people. But problem is, many times we ask the question, we don't get them.
You don't get the answers.
We don't get the answer, or we get the wrong answers. I'll just put one example. There is very known that concerning the so-called Brussels. One of the big point is the very nice play of the politician to say that when they won something in the Brussels, they said that we won this. And when they agreed something in Brussels, and this final solution came back to Prague, and Paris, and London, they said it's the Brussels who decided this. This is strange schizophrenia. I never get the answer why.
Buck passing is very, very well known amongst politicians.
That's just an example. Then we don't get the answers. Yeah? And another, I think, good question is I would like to to ask Mr. Rouček what to do with the European Parliament. It's only directly elected body in the European Union, but unfortunately it is not well respected and not well popular. Of course, when we came to Brussels, the building of the European Parliament, we see that it's very vivid, that's where we can get some many information. But, sorry, the European Parliament, or people from the European Parliament, they are not present on the national scene. My question is what to do with this, because the result we will see in May of this.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. When you ask a British journalist why don't you cover Europe, and it's pretty scandalous, the coverage in Britain, they come up with one word: boring. It's just too boring. So I sometimes think, and I think people like Anne have a role, or some of the intellectuals here have a role in making it more exciting. Of course, I shouldn't say that at this time because Ukraine changes the whole discussion. So thank you for that. Did you want to come back on my question to you? Adam's had a go. Do you want to say anything about the role of the media in making Europe? Because I didn't ask it before. If you want to, Kateřina.
Well, maybe just on the fact that you mentioned that EU is boring. It is boring because it is afraid of conflict. It fears conflict so much because of the historical legacy, heritage, that it sort of like wipes out a natural conflict among different political ideologies, which means that at the very end of the day, it is boring. So what I would recommend is actually more conflict, more natural conflict to the EU. Between the right and left, liberals and socialists, etc. Really. I mean, that's what we are sort of like striving for as journalists, to find some conflict we could report on, but we don't find anything.
Everyone's too nice. Did you want to say anything?
Just a very small remark, because you said the word boring, and you used often a different word. That word is the EU is unsexy.
Unsexy.
And
same thing. That's just journalism.
That's journalism. And this, of course, is a case of supply and demand, and there is, of course, some special role for media, and that's some kind of education too.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, you've been very, very good. You've been listening, and you've had silence. So let me invite you to join the conversation. I think we can take a number of questions. We have one already here, and then I will ask, and you three have been brilliant, because you've asked a direct forensic question to each of our panelists. So you've done it exactly right. So let's start with you.
I'm from Cardiff Law School, and first of all, and there's not a single element of irony in it, I would like to thank His Excellency, the French Ambassador, for addressing the panel and the auditorium in English. We have a big cultural change here, because this wouldn't be possible in the past, and of course it's very important for any dialogue to share a common language, a language. It doesn't matter whether it's English, French, German, and of course it has nothing to do with the British Empire, because we in Wales, we speak Welsh, but it has all to do with internet and technologies, and Europe is part of it now, and it's part of globalization. So it's important that we can communicate our problems in global context. And my question to all panelists actually is, and I fully agree with what Kateřina Šafaříková said, that we shy away from conflict. And I think that there may be a growing systemic conflict in the European Union, which is between economy and politics. When the crisis started, it was, of course, we knew it started with the collapse of the private economic system. Markets had to be bailed out by the states. What is the consequence? The consequence is the growth of the sovereign debt, and now markets dictating how austere you have to be, how you have to treat your citizens, your populations. So and the response of the European Union is exactly disastrous in this sense that it follows the language of the markets rather than the language of its electorate and its citizens. And I wonder whether it's because exactly political elites in Europe are cowardly and shy away from conflicts which have global context, because Europe would have to show much more pulling power against the other competing economies like China, like India, like the United States, and whether actually European political elite should be asked to do more for covering and defending European social citizenship, which has nothing to do with the left and right, which is a complex concept of the post-war social consensus in Europe.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I see another hand? I can, just here. I wanted to, the French ambassador will speak for himself, but I wonder whether his surname is a clue to his comfort in being able to speak English.
And Czech.
And Czech. And Czech, of course.
Martin Butra from Institute for Public Affairs in Bratislava. My question is to the journalist. You are saying that the European agenda or EU is either boring or unsexy. What about, and you also said that the key task of the journalist is to ask appropriate questions, and asking appropriate people or politicians. What about the comments? What about analysis? In how far do you think in your comments and in your analysis are you somehow able, within the limited space which is today the current situation of most of the media, in how far are you able to offer, to provide appropriate description and analysis of what's actually going on?
Can I press you? Do you feel the analysis is not good enough? Is that what's behind your question?
No, I'm reading, not of these three journalists, I'm reading their text, and I admire that in a very short space.
They are the best three, we chose.
But in general, it is the really challenge for journalists.
Okay, thank you. Who else would like to come in? We should take at least two more. One there. And I'm looking to the back as well, because you're part of the conversation. So don't be shy. Please.
European movement. I think we've got something upside down here. We are talking about the general problem of young people in particular, people in general, not coming to the elections. Now, coming less and less, I mean in Europe, also in individual nations and so on. Now, we're trying to find some way of persuading them to do so. Now, that seems to me to be the wrong point from which to go. Somebody goes to elections not to demonstrate his loyalty to the system, but rather to achieve something. Now, if somebody does not go to the elections, he obviously has no particular need to push for something in this manner. Now, traditionally, this was overcome in democracies by parties trying to get out the vote. We don't hear about the parties trying to get out the vote. At least I don't.
Okay.
I think the problem is not with the media, but rather with the parties. Second point, this is directly to what Valkering raised. The young people have a different way of getting information than we used to. The change is enormous in this particular generational situation. I think we can find a parallel only in the invention of print. Now, in this situation, somebody said before on one of the panels that young people can communicate with each other and therefore they don't need to communicate as much across generational barriers. Sure, but again, parties certainly, and nobody else is trying to do anything about bridging this gap. Now obviously they're not going to go to vote for something where nobody knows what anything is about, and on top of it their friends are not going to. And we're not approaching that problem at all, yes?
Thank you very much. I actually go out every day for an hour to canvass or campaign for my party. I'm a bit of a political nerd. But what I know statistically is that if I knock on the door of an older person, over 50, that person is 5 times more likely to vote than someone who's under 25. So the technical instruction to me, as a Democrat, I should spend 5 times more with the under 25-year-old, but as a person committed to my party, I should spend 5 times less. So there's an irony for you. But Anne will answer these questions. Thank you. 2 more questions, please, and then, so we've got one in the Czech, well, you go first, yes. And then the man in the Czech show.
Yes, Roman from here, from Prague. I would like to express similar concern that has been expressed by Mikhail Žantovský after the last panel. We have heard a lot about dangers of social dumping from abroad, from emerging markets, because young people there are working very hard for low salaries, so they are competitive. We have heard that solutions should focus on social citizenship and redistribution. But isn't part of the problem, of the current problem, insufficient creation of wealth in Europe? Shouldn't we focus more on wealth creation? Isn't one of the problems willingness of people, including young people in Europe, to enjoy leisure and wealth and welfare without working hard enough? So I would say that if we focus on redistribution without wealth creation, sooner or later we wouldn't have that wealth to redistribute, first of all.
Thank you. I think that is a major debate, but in terms of some of the discussion earlier, wealth creation at what cost is the question mark. Now we have one gentleman there, and then I would really like if I can be so bold, as a woman who might like to contribute. So we've had five men, and the conversation is incomplete in my view. So we need to speak up. And it's working, it's working.
We tried, but the microphone.
Is it better?
Yep.
Okay. Michal Čakr, Swiss Business School, Zurich. Zurich is a banking capital of the world, perhaps, and I have an answer to my distinguished colleague from Cardiff. If you overspend and live on somebody else's expenses, you have to dance to the tune that he or she sings. That's simple. So you have to cut probably the overpaid state employees, better collect the taxes, and do other things. If you overspend like Adolf Hitler in 1930s, many people praise him for a wonderful industrial and employment policy. The only way out in these old days was one, the war. So if there was not the European Union and European solidarity, the only way for Greece would be to probably go to war with Libya or wherever as I was. So it's very simple. The economy dictates the politics, especially if there is no money.
Okay, thank you very much. We're focusing mostly in this session on democracy, but obviously economics and market is a key part of that. I don't want to get into a huge debate on austerity or neo-con or neoclassical economics. Can we have one more contributor, if there is one? You can't see very much.
There is a lady there.
Oh, marvelous! Thank you very much.
I'm Austrian, and for me, the most question is always where you are coming from and what you are doing. And for me, the question what you are doing is combined with wealthy and work. And I think Europe is really wealthy, but our society have changed, and we are not now anymore work doesn't come from industry but from knowledge, and I think this is something what we really have to rethink. We need a new definition of work.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to close the open session from the floor and invite some of our panelists to make short final comments in response. They can't deal with every question, I'm sure. Before I come to this side, there was a question to you about analyses. Would one of you like to make a comment about, rather than reporting and questioning, the question about, you know, feature writing, in-depth explanation, understanding? Who works for Respect? That's a thoughtful magazine. So tell us. Yeah.
I will try to answer your question concerning the media, and also to react to the remark concerning the English. First point, first of all, concerning the journalists, especially in Czech Republic. Of course, I'm not speaking about my friends here, because we are writing about the European affairs since years. But the problem with the Czech journalists, of course, and many of the Czech politicians, is the provincialism. I remember well the very nice phrase of some editor in public TV who has said, "I don't want to spoil my main news emission with the European Union." Yeah, that's the attitude. That's the one point. The second point concerning the English. I don't want to exaggerate the influence, because this influence is limited. I know many of my colleagues who the only language they know is English, and many of them they read the news information through the English and through the British media. They are very, very good, but I don't think that that's the only way to see this thing. I'm reading in three languages. I can tell you that the picture is much more complex and maybe much more accurate. So as a conference language, it's okay, but to get the information and to get the accurate picture, I would prefer to have in Europe not only English but at least one more language. Of course, okay. my Pierre, mon ami Pierre préfère le français.
Thank you very much, Adam. I suppose that since you've been such good participants in this conference, you will no doubt go back and write very good think pieces about what you've heard today and how wonderful this conference is, and that will be the beginning of the continuing discussion. I always feel that there are two papers that do dominate the public sphere. One is the FT, of Europe I mean, and the other is probably The Economist. They're quite similar, they're sort of neoclassical in a way. So those of you who argue for more social justice type of approaches probably have a point. But they are very, very well written and very, very informative. Now, let me go back to our panelists, and I will take them in this row. And first of all, Libor, who's had a question about response, engagement, remoteness. Yeah.
Exactly, and European Parliament and media. It is a well-known fact that in European Parliament about 60–65% of the legislation that is being then adopted into domestic laws, whether it's Czech Republic, France and so on, is being made in the European Parliament and in the European institutions. Now, take the Czech media as an example. How many correspondents do we have in Brussels? 2 or 3? I give you another example, Albania, which is not part of the EU, country of 3 million people, the poorest country in Europe, and Albania has 12 correspondents in Brussels. Every week I'm on one of the Albanian channels in Albania. In the Czech TV, once in 6 months, when we have some crisis like in the Ukraine. So should we think about this? When we talk about the role of the media, media has this role of to inform, to educate, apart from entertain. Is the Czech media playing this? I'm afraid it's not. When I drive by car from Strasbourg, where we have the plenary session. In Germany I hear Deutschlandfunk or Bayern they report, or when you read Frankfurter Allgemeine, you know what the European Parliament has decided. When I switch on at the border the Czech radio or read the newspaper next morning, there is nothing. There is absolutely nothing, and of course it has impact on the voters. Now the voters' participation. The voters, we will see it again in May. We saw it 2009, 2004. The voters' participation for the European Parliament is not lower than we have the participation for the regional elections or for the Senate elections. In fact, is higher than we have for the Senate elections. So I think the question is broader, both in this country and in other countries. And if we go to the United States, the participation of young people, you know, whether it's local elections or to Congress or even presidential, isn't that much higher than we have in Europe. On the contrary, European Parliament, the European institutions, you know, play very important role. But when Mr. Přiban asked about the markets, so who is putting the brake on it? Who is putting the brake on financial transactions? Who is putting the brakes on financial or banking regulation? It's not the European Parliament, because then even the EPP, even the Conservatives vote for it. But they are the government, such as the British government. So let's not blame, you know, the European Parliament or the European institutions. Finally, just a short word about, you know, social dumping, wealth creation. In Europe, we have some of the most competitive and socially equal and attractive economies. If we take Scandinavia, if we take Germany, if we take Austria, where I also used to live for 4 or 5 years, you know, these countries are more competitive, more socially just equal than, I don't know, United States or Japan, not mentioning China. Social dumping. In Europe, also as a result of the enlargement, we have huge differences. If we take the average wage, you know, in Germany, it's still, you know, 7 times, 8 times more than what we have in Romania and Bulgaria. Now you have Romanian or Bulgarian workers coming to France or Netherlands, and we have to have some rules, because we cannot have Romanian or Bulgarian wages in Germany. You know, so they have, and that's what the people call social dumping. And if we don't do something about it, so you can be sure that the French and the Germans and the Dutch and the others will turn against the EU, and within a few years we have nothing here. We have total disintegration, chaos, conflicts, the same way we had before, you know, or between the wars. So that's why we have to also pay attention to these issues of you know, social dumping and so on.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, can I still on overspending? The Irish, they didn't overspend. They had balanced budget. They had budget surplus. What happened in Ireland? They didn't look after the financial speculators. Neither in Ireland nor in Europe as a whole. Because we have global system, global capitalism, we have to create global rules, which will protect both the banks and of course the taxpayers. Because it's very unfair in Ireland and in other countries that a normal taxpayer should be paying for the debts that the financial speculators make. Not even the bankers, but financial speculators.
Okay, thank you very much, Libor. So Anne, how do we, practical, how do we actually get, how can we help young people to get engaged?
The simplest way would be for the EU to fix big problems, but I don't think that within 3 months we solve youth unemployment or any other economic crisis thing. So more practically, I think the main duties at the moment don't necessarily lie with the EU. I think EU institutions, and particularly the EU Parliament and Commission, have done a whole lot of explaining to people, reaching out to young people through the Youth in Action programme, through their website, through consultations, trying to get young people to actually engage in discussions online. But the main responsibility now lies with politicians, the politicians who compete in European parliamentary elections, but treat them as national parliament elections, and that basically use national issues in their European elections instead of using international European issues. That would be a very big step towards creating not necessarily less distrust, but definitely a lot more understanding for European Parliament issues, which would be a very important thing. And I think what is important, on the other hand, to connect to young people is not to create a new structure and tell them, let's now, or an old structure, and just keep that structure and tell them, you need to connect to us in the way that we want to, in the way that we understand social media, in the way that we understand the internet, but that people actually try to connect with young people in the way that young people connect to the internet, connect to social media, and connect to each other. Now, I'm too old to actually know how that happens. I try to keep up, but I just started using WhatsApp, and now it's bought by Facebook, and now everyone's moving to another app, and I don't know which one. But there will be specialists who can tell politicians how to do that, and I think that's very important, not to create new structures, use ones that are there. Lastly, I think one thing that I personally believe in, but I have no clue whether this is ever going to happen, and that is the idea that European Parliament elections should not run along the lines of countries, but that they should be actual European Parliament elections where I can vote for a Greek person or a Czech person instead of just having to vote for a Dutch person, and I can talk about ideology, and we can look at conflict on ideological lines instead of on country lines where we have an actual discussion and can find real solutions.
Okay, thank you, Anne. I think you can vote for a Greek person if the Greek person is standing from a Dutch constituency. But your point about electioneering is very important. MEPs in England, in Britain, always go on the stump, as we say, go out to the voters by explaining what they can bring to their constituency from Europe. What we can do for you is always the message. It is never that wider set of issues and ideas. I don't know whether Libor may be an exception, but basically in Britain it's you know, what gravy can we bring back from Brussels? Well, that's not very healthy. Monsieur l'Ambassadeur, I could speak now. So I invite you to contribute. I daren't call you Jean-Claude. I mean, it would be too familiar. Jean-Pierre. No, Jean-Pierre, sorry. Jean-Claude would be completely wrong. Okay, so for you, do we have a fresh definition of Europe? You know, if the freedom of movement idea is a little bit too taken for granted, and if you want to say something about language.
Very quickly about values, because you mentioned freedom of movement. Maybe some of these values are taken for granted, but you just, Kateřina mentioned the fact also that they might be sometimes threatened, discussed, or put in doubt, like solidarity, the freedom of movement. So I think we still have to fight for values, and we did that from the very beginning of the creation of the process of European integration, but it's still, the fight is still going on. These values are not acquired forever, and we still need to fight for them. And, but I think solidarity is still there. Solidarity inside each country, inside the poorest between the poorest regions and the richest region. The cohesion fund, for example, a wonderful example of what can be done because of solidarity. And I think there is also an element which is important to explain what solidarity is to the people. Is actually because of solidarity, you actually increase the living standards of people throughout you create a bigger market, and in a way, the solidarity effort that you ask from the citizen actually are repaid in a way because you create better wealth and better living standards, better living conditions, and in a way bigger market. And this is why actually the economy and the social elements and solidarity elements are very closely.
You don't see it. You don't see it as an either/or, which one or two speakers have hinted at. You know, we have to do something first, and if we succeed, the other comes.
I do believe so, and I also think that in the next year, and to get out of this crisis, the social element will be essential. We spoke a lot about economy, about the eurozone, but I think that now the social element of this of Europe, of the economic and monetary union, must be addressed and maybe strengthened. And I'm sure it's one of the greatest challenge we face actually is the social aspect of the EU.
Thank you very much. And a final word from Petr, and then we wrap up. Peter.
We never should underestimate the knowledge of people, the knowledge they have on how politics is run. This is the illusion of many politicians. Politicians usually think that people know more than they actually know, because the politicians do not ask the questions. I have participated in 3 election campaigns in the Senate. I am an urban person, an intellectual, and I had to canvass in the country. It was very difficult, but at the first or second meeting with the voters, I discovered they did not know at all what is the Senate, why is it there, why we have 2 rounds, how the votes are calculated, and so on. And from that moment on, all my campaigns stressed the importance of explaining how it works. The people, I admit that it needs some pedagogical gifts or talents, and it also needs to be a bit humble, because I have to respect that people have other worries, but they have always been so grateful that someone was there and was able to explain and repeat again and again. I think that I got the vote thanks to the talent I had. The politicians do not do that. They do not know how to do it. They do not know that people do not know. And of course, it is not surprising that people who do not know are not interested or are confused and disorientated and behave in an irrational way during the election. It is a pity, because it is also a sort of election capital to have this capacity. I do not need to convince the voters that I'm the best and I'll give that and promise that. I always won my campaigns thanks to the patient explanation of the elementary basis of the things that people did not really know.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Peter. So this conversation was what democracy. And remember, we've been discussing democracy for more than 2,000 years, and we haven't agreed. Moreover, what the intellectuals tell us is that we can't agree. It's what in jargon is called an essentially contested term. And I suspect that we're discussing what Europe will probably not agree quite what Europe is also for thousands of years. But, and here I'm going to quote a good friend of mine who always says, if you're still a bit confused after our wonderful conversation, we hope you're confused at a higher level.